I talked about the options for greenhouse gas emission reduction, and I sort of hinted at some of the difficulties that are there, as well as a crude indication of the costs. I'm going to talk a bit more about the costs and try and put some numbers on. First thing to note, and the first take-home message is that the costs of emission reduction are real and they're positive. There's some people out there who claim that this is not the case, but it's typically because they get their accounting wrong or because they have miscalibrated their model. And there's two intuitions that I will provide why you would expect these costs to be positive, that is real, and actually sets you back with user welfare. And the first intuition is that without climate policy, emissions are essentially free. You do with the CO2 whatever you want. Whereas with climate policy, you can't do that. You either have to pay for emitting them in the form of carbon tax or in the form of buying a permit to do so, or there is some mandated constraint on your behavior. So, first situation, emissions are free. In the second situation, emissions are not free. Nothing else has changed, and that must mean that your costs have gone up, your income has come down. Alternatively, if you're well versed in calculus, then you would realize that really what climate policy does is if you assume an agent that somehow optimizes either profits or welfare or what have you, what climate policy does is it adds a constraint to that optimization problem. And if you recall your calculus, then you would know that an additional constraint, provided that the constraint bites, that is, it reduces emissions, necessarily reduces welfare. Your costs go up or your income goes down. So with those two intuitions, let's have a look at some of the model results. So this is a nice table that is nice and small, so you can't see the numbers, but it contains a lot of insights. These are results from the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, which is a group of energy and climate modelers that occasionally get together and run their models in such a way that we can actually learn something about the respective behaviors of these models. And in this particular round, 22, these 11 or so models that you see listed and named there ran a whole bunch of climate policies. And as you move through the table, there's different climate policies depicted. And the cost here is measured at the margin. So this is the carbon tax that you should impose on emissions in the year 2020. Now, instead of taking you through these numbers, let's look at graphs. And these graphs just show different cross sections of. So the graphs show different cross sections through this table. And let's just focus on the qualitative impact. So in the graph that is in blue, essentially we're looking at the same climate policy, but with different models running the same thing. And the first thing you notice is that these models strongly disagree with one another. What is the carbon tax that should be imposed on greenhouse gas emissions in order to meet the same target? And the difference between the lowest and the highest bar is an order of magnitude. Some say the answer is 2, and others say the answer is $20 per ton of carbon, per ton of CO2 in the year 2020. That is disturbing, right? that if you put together the best minds in the world, so the best minds who have thought about this in the world, and you give them a simple question, what is the carbon tax that we should be imposing in 10 years' time in order to reach a certain target, then the range of answers is so large. I'll get to the structural differences between the models, why some say it's expensive and others say it's cheap. There is another aspect to it. When this literature started in the early 1990s, climate policy was something of the future. And if climate policy is something of the future and you want to understand it, there's only one thing you can do, and that is build a model. Simulation model, an optimization model, an equilibrium model, or what have you, and compare two examples. A future world with climate policy and a future world without climate policy. That was the only option back then. Momentum in academia is such that people are still doing this. And 20 years later, this is still the bulk of the literature on climate policy. Let's take a model and compare two counterfactuals. Example. And what people have not sort of caught on to is that by now we have 20 years of experience with climate policy. So we can actually look into the past, what did these climate policies really do, and make a proper policy evaluation of its impact. That has not penetrated the minds yet of people who are in this business. And as a result, what we are confronted with is 10 models saying completely different things. And even though we, in principle, have the data available to tell us which of these models is closer to the truth or closer to the data, we haven't done so. By the moment, the answer is maybe 2, it may be 20, depending on who of these people, who of these, which of these models do you find more credible. But there's an enormous difference there, and we should never forget that the costs of climate policy is actually very, very uncertain. The other graph at the top gives another important lesson, and that is that the question, what is the cost of climate policy, is a silly question to ask. Because there is no such thing as climate policy. Climate policy can come at different intensities, and that is what you see if you move to the right in that graph. If you go for a median target, stabilizing greenhouse gas concentration in the year 2100 at 650 parts per million CO2 equivalent, then it will set you back. These are not total costs. Then you need to impose a carbon tax that is fairly low. And if you go to a very stringent target, 450, then the carbon tax you need to impose is much, much higher. Shouldn't come as no surprise, right? But what you sometimes see in the media is that people talk about the cost of climate policy as if that is somehow a defined thing. There's many degrees of freedom within climate policy. Another thing that you're seeing is the blue versus the red versus the green. The blue is your least cost climate policy, and there's two things that are done. The first is that in the blue, the target holds for the end of the century, for the end of the century only. So we want to reach 450 parts per million in the year 2100, but we don't care about the concentration in the year 2090. That is one goal. But another way of formulating this target is that you never want to exceed those 450 during the century. That makes it a lot more expensive. That is essentially the red addition that can easily double your cost. So again, there is a degree of freedom in what do you mean by climate policy. The green addition is a bit more serious. we see that the costs more than double again at the margin. And the difference between the red and the blue and the green is participation. So in the blue and the red scenario, all countries across the world enthusiastically embrace climate policy by the year 2020, and everybody cuts their emissions. In the green, it's only the rich countries that enthusiastically embrace climate policy by the year 2020. Which in itself is a tall order, right? The Americans don't seem particularly keen. The Japanese seem to have lost interest as well. But the assumption is that by 2020, they go at it full speed. And then the Chinese and the Indians follow by 2030, and the Africans follow by 2050. And obviously this drives up the cost because the eventual target is the same. It's a global target. But now only a handful of countries are actually trying to achieve this target, and therefore necessarily the cost of those handful of countries is a lot more expensive. Try to achieve the same thing, but with fewer people involved. And that drives up the cost quite substantially, as you can see in these graphs. That is something to keep in mind. This table, the same information, but now it gives the total costs. The total costs are here measured in trillions of dollars over the century, and discounted at 5% discount rates to today. You may not be able to read the numbers, so the highest number that you see there is 263, if I'm not mistaken. You may say $263 trillion. It's quite a bit of money. I wish I had it in my bank account. It's actually not that large compared to the scale of the world economy. This is actually measured in hundreds of trillions as well, and that is per year, and this is over an entire century. So the total cost of emission reduction, actually, if you pick smart policy and not a stringent target, sort of disappears into the noise. We're talking about over a century, something that is less than 1% of the total output in 1 year. One way of phrasing that, perhaps the starkest illustration of how small the cost of emission reduction can be, is that the income we would reach without climate policy in the 1st of January 2100, we would reach on the 1st of March or perhaps the 1st of July in the year 2100, or perhaps the 1st of January in the year 2101. It just disappears into the noise. It's a very minor cost. Now, why do these models differ so strongly? And if you systematically compare the estimates of the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction, you would find the following insights. And that is that abatement costs are higher if there are fewer options to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If your model assumes there's no carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and storage only available on a very limited scale because of political concerns, then you take an option off the table and you simply incur a higher cost of reaching, or if it's not a lower cost of reaching the target. Second reason is that different models make different assumptions about what is the basic difference between the cost of fossil fuel and the cost of renewables. And I gave you the example that coal costs 4 cents per kilowatt hour and wind about 8 cents per kilowatt hour. Those numbers are actually not nearly as solid as I made it out to be before the break. Cost of coal goes up and down, and different people use different configurations of the power plant. So 4 is a rough gas. Ditto for the 8, that's also a rough gas. And different models have made different gases. And if you think that wind comes at 7 and coal at 5, then the difference is only 2. As in the example I gave, the difference was 4. And it makes a big difference in sort of the initial signal that you give to the cost of providing energy to your economy. There's much greater uncertainty, much greater disagreements about what will these costs be in the future. You can't perfectly observe the present, but you can't observe the future. And climate policy is something that we're going to do over a century or so. So what matters for the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction is not so much what is the relative cost of wind to coal today, but what is the relative cost of wind to coal in 2020 and 2050 and in the year 2100. And different people simply make different assumptions about how those relative costs change over time. And obviously, if you assume that we're going to run out of fossil fuels relatively soon, so the cost is going up, and there will be a lot of technological progress in renewables, so the costs are coming down, then you will have low costs of climate policy. But if you don't make those assumptions, then you will have much higher costs. The fourth reason why models differ is that some assume that the rate of technological progress responds to climate policy, whereas others think that this is a bit of a dangerous assumption. But if you build into your model the assumption that if you're going to invest in wind power today, then a lot of people will invest in R&D in wind power, and that means that in the future wind power will become cheaper than it otherwise would have been. Then of course you drive down the cost of emission reduction further. I'll come back to that this afternoon. Finally, if you assume that price elasticities are low, substitution elasticities are low, then you will have higher costs. So far I've been talking about energy supply. So if we switch from fossil fuels to renewables, the price of energy goes up. If you assume that agents have a low price elasticity, then you will not see a large reduction in energy use. Whereas if you assume that they have a high price elasticity, then you will see on top of the energy switching, you will also see a lot of energy saving. And different people have made different assumptions about price elasticity. Now, people agree that in the short run, price elasticities are low. In the long run, price elasticities may be much higher, but there's a lot more uncertainty about it because long-term price elasticities and how to measure the short-term price elasticity because we have less data on the long run than on the short run by definition. But we observe the short term very frequently, but the long run only infrequently, right? And then it has a lot to do with the characteristic lifetime of capital. People disagree on that as well. So take transport demand. If the price of fuels go up, because of climate policy or because of some other reason, then you still have to go to work. You still have to go to school. So that does not immediately change your behavior. So in the short run, the price elasticity of transport energy demand is low. In the longer run, it may be that the price stays high, and next time you buy a new car, you buy a more fuel efficient car because you expect the prices to continue to be high. And then you do see a change, and maybe a substantial change in your energy demand. And it may be that in the even longer run, you decide to move, and because the energy prices are still high, you decide to move closer to work. And then your energy demand falls again, right? So short-term price elasticities are low, long-term price elasticities are much higher, Exactly how much higher is very hard to pin down, and different people make different assumptions, and a lot of it depends on the characteristic lifetime of the capital that we use for this. And that's actually hard to pin down what this is really. You can say, well, people own a car for 3 years, so they replace the car every 3 years, and that is the time at which we make substantial adjustments in our energy demand. And also say, yeah, but the average lifetime of car on the road is 10 years, so we should be using 10 years rather than 3 years as the replacement time. But you could also say, well, the internal combustion engine has been around for 120 years. So that is the lifetime I should be using. Different people make different assumptions about just how responsive an economy is to price signals, and that drives the difference in costs estimates to a large extent. As I said, we have not made a substantial enough effort to sort out which assumption is better. One more point I want to make about EMF 22 before moving on. What you're looking at here, the model's the same set of exercises as you move to the right in the diagram. Climate policy becomes more stringent. The different colors denote different models. The vertical axis shows where emissions in 2050 should be relative to the year 2000. And you see the line 100. So some models say in 2050 we can emit a little bit more than we did in the recent past. Most models say actually we should be below 100%. We should have substantial cuts in emission reduction by the year 2050. These are global emission reductions, and they range from somewhere between 80% emission reduction relative to the year 2000, so we're at 20% of emissions in the year 2050, up to 20% emission reduction, 80% emission. And then if climate policy becomes more stringent, we should go to lower and lower and lower and lower. What you see there are a lot of negative emissions. Nothing, no mistake. How can you generate negative emissions? One option is a lot of afforestation, a lot of new trees planted, and the other is to use a biomass plant with carbon capture and storage. So the plant sucks up carbon when it grows. You stick it in an oven. You burn it, but you capture the CO2 and stick it somewhere on the ground. So you actually on net have sucked carbon out of the atmosphere. What you see is that you actually need this according to a lot of models. The other thing that you see is a box at the bottom, and a lot of models end up in this box. And essentially what this box captures is those models that could not solve the climate problem or did not want to report the results. Some of them that could not solve it could not do so because of physical reasons. The way they represented the physics of the climate system and the carbon cycle in the models said we can't reach this target, not without breaking the laws of physics, or in other words, not in this universe. Whereas other models had numerical problems, and there the answer was essentially computer says no, I'm not going to do it. Those are two reasons why people end up in the bottom box. The third reason that people were there was, yeah, my model can solve it, but the results are so ridiculous, I'm not going to report it. Because I need to assume that in 5 years' time the costs of energy go up fivefold. Because of policy interventions, that means revolution on the streets. So even though my model says it's technically and economically feasible, I don't believe it's politically feasible. So I'm not going to report these results for fear of looking silly, right? Now, what you see is that as climate policy gets more stringent, more and more models end up in the no can't do box. Which is exactly as you would expect. Why do I show this figure? Why do I talk about it? Is because these targets on the right-hand side, 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent by the year 2100, those are the targets that have been officially adopted by the European Union and that are being discussed a lot by the United Nations. This is what our politicians, this is what our dear leaders want to do. But a lot of the best models in the world says we can't. And therefore this is relevant, right? It seems that politicians are making promises that may involve breaking the laws of physics. Which is an important thing to keep in mind. Of course, politics has no such constraints, right? Talk a little bit more about the cost, and then I'm going to move on to the final topic for this morning. This is again EMF, but a slightly older set of results. You see different concentration scenarios at the top left. In blue, you see scenarios, and then in dotted black, you see scenarios. And the important thing to notice there is that they end up in the same concentration. Then in the graph immediately under it, you're looking at the emission profiles, so not concentrations, but emissions. And what you see is that for the corresponding alternative scenarios, the blue lines start deviating from a world without climate policy soon or now, whereas the dotted black ones deviate much later from the world without climate policy. But then, of course, because they end up in the same final situation, they have to work much harder. So there's one set of scenarios that says start slow and accelerate, and the other set of scenarios says start big but keep it up roughly in the same rate throughout the season. And then the question is, which of the two is cheaper? The answer follows from comparing the graph, the bars and graph on the top side. You always have to skip one bar. So you compare this scenario to this scenario, and this scenario to different scenarios. And what you see is that according to some models, by going from the blue to the black scenario, you could save costs by about 10%. And in some of the models, you see that the difference is actually more like 2/3, more like 70%. Even if it were 10%, it's 10% of 20 trillion, so that's $2 trillion. It's not something to sneeze at. Now, why is it so much cheaper to start slow and accelerate? There's 4 reasons. One is the capital stock turnover, and I talked about it already, in the difference between the short and the long-term price elasticities. If you impose a high carbon tax now, you don't reduce a lot of emissions now, because the demand for energy is slightly elastic. But you are incurring real costs, because you are essentially punishing people for decisions they made well before there was a carbon tax or talk of a carbon tax. You're incurring a real cost on them. Whereas if you sort of like raise the carbon tax every time people make a replacement decision, costs will be much lower. So if you work with the capital stock turnover, you simply incur a much smaller cost than when you just impose a large shock in the beginning. Definitely if that large shock is unannounced. That's one reason. Second reason is technological progress. Most of these models assume, probably correctly, that the relative cost of renewables is coming down relative to fossil fuels, and that means that emission reduction in the future will be cheaper than emission reduction today, because the alternatives simply are more mature and cheaper. So that is a reason to wait. Third reason is good old discounting. Costs incurred in the future are less valuable than costs incurred today. So that is a reason to wait and accelerate. And the fourth reason is very similar, but works through physics rather than through economics. The carbon we put into the atmosphere today gets degraded over time. So if you have a target in the year 2100, or in this case in the year 2300, then emission reductions in the year 2015 don't contribute as much to meeting that target as emissions in the year 2019. Because those emissions will have had less time to melt and break. Right? Double negatives and triple negatives. So the carbon cycle acts as a discount rate. And therefore it is better from a carbon cycle perspective to cut emissions later, because that's simply more effective. Right? So those are all reasons why you would want to postpone greenhouse gas emission reduction. Now, so far I've been talking about your standard economic story that emission reduction costs money. I think that is the correct story, but there's two serious challenges to it, and that I'm going to talk about in the last, hopefully, 10 or 15 minutes. A lot of engineers out there that say that we can reduce emissions at negative cost, that is, grow the economy and cut emissions at the same time. Most of this is complete bogus. There is confusion between energy efficiency improvements through the markets and energy efficiency improvements through policy. And here is again the same picture. I think in the 6th year of his presidency, George W. Bush announced his climate policy, and what he promised to do was improve energy efficiency over the next decade by 10%. Not by 10% more than it otherwise would have been, but by 10%. He did not realize that, apparently, nor did his advisors, that energy efficiency has been improved by 18% per decade over the previous 3 decades. So that sort of confusion is there, and people think that they can sort of take credit for what the market does anyway. And also in the engineering models that are used to support these claims, there are simply incredible assumptions. A lot of energy saving, a lot of alternative energy essentially require an upfront investment, new equipment, and in return there's cost savings later. So if you buy a new heating system or you buy a carbon efficient one, that would set you back 3, 4, 5,000 euros. So then in return you get lower energy bills, a few €100 less per year for the next 10, 15 years. So the trade-off between the upfront cost and the cost savings later depends on your interest rate. And for some bizarre reason, a lot of engineers think that households can borrow at the same rate of interest as their government can, much lower than the real capital constraints of households. And if you make that assumption, yes, this looks like a very lucrative investment. If you incur the real cost of capital to households and the real liquidity and capital constraints that people are under, then it's not such a lucrative investment. So a lot of these claims are simply bogus. That is not to say that we can't do proper economics and negative abatement costs. Um, and the mechanism is something as follows. So the economic models for which I've shown some results and all the other ones that are out there are typically optimization models or equilibrium models. And by the first welfare theorem, can we keep the central piece? By the first welfare theorem, we know that optimization and equilibrium can be keep the central piece, or you can just go talk out elsewhere. Right? If you're not interested, there's no reason for you to be here. But the first welfare theorem, equilibrium model, and optimization model are of course equivalent. Now, if your starting point is an optimum or an equilibrium, then whatever you do, you're going to incur a cost. One way of picturing this is that if you're at the top of the hill, then the only way is down. Right? That's the definition of the top of the hill. And that's where we assume the economy to be in most of our economic models. But we know that the economy is not perfect. We know that markets are distorted in many, many ways. So we are not at the top of the hill. And if you're somewhere on the hill, at the top of the hill, whether you're moving north or east or south or west, you're going to go down. If you're somewhere on the hill, it may be that if you move north, you go up. It may be that if you move north, you go down. Right? We just don't know. So can we do this? The way most of the literature thinks about this is through the distortionality of the fiscal system. And a tax is more distortionary if the tax base is narrower, the price elasticity is higher. This is intuitive. So in the economy without a tax, we are in an undistorted equilibrium. And now a tax comes along and changes our behavior, makes us do things that we would otherwise not have done. And because our starting point was the optimum, that is a welfare loss. And the distortion that a tax brings is stronger if per euro of tax raised, fewer people pay their tax. Because then those fewer people pay a higher tax, and therefore their behavior gets more distorted. Right? So that makes tax more distortionary. Similarly, if the price elasticity is higher, our response to a price signal is greater, and therefore the change in our behavior is larger. That means that our welfare loss is greater too. As a rule of thumb in public economics, the death rate welfare loss to the economy of a tax is roughly quadratic in the level of that tax. So if we now put those three things together, right, what we can do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions through a carbon tax. What does that do to our economy? Obviously, we force people to use forms of energy and less energy than they otherwise would have done, so that imposes a cost. Does that distort the economy a lot? Well, the tax base is broad. Everybody uses energy, so that is not a big deal. Price elasticities are low, so it's actually not very distortionary either. And then current carbon tax is roughly zero. So raising it to a higher level does not create a large deficit cost. Now, if the government does that, it has revenue from the carbon tax. And the question is, what will the government do with that carbon tax? Well, it may be that it's a smart government and says, I'm going to use this for fiscal reform. I'm not going to use this to pay more money to nurses or buy more nice buildings for ministers to sit in, but I'm actually going to reduce the labor. What does that do to your economy? Well, then 30% of people or so pay the labor tax, so the tax rate is narrower. Price elasticities are not that high, so that doesn't make a big difference. But the starting point of the labor tax is actually quite high. So a reduction in labor tax actually leads to a large reduction in the debt they lost to the economy. So if you do it this, you shift the tax burden from labor to carbon, you actually have an economic gain. And that economic gain may be larger than the economic cost of climate policy. And in that case, you're in a win-win situation. You're reducing emissions and stimulating the economy at the same time. So theoretically, it's possible. Then there's something for you to look at home. Yes, you can also see this in numerical models. It depends on what country you're looking at. It depends on what you assume about the labor market. It depends what you do with your tax revenue, and it depends what you do with your tax revenue, also conditional on the country that you're in. And we focus on this table. This is for the US, a slightly older result. If they use the carbon tax to send everybody a check in the post, lump sum, there's a net welfare loss. If they use it to reduce income taxes, there's a welfare loss. But if they use it to reduce profit taxes, corporate taxes, there is actually an income gain. And definitely if you use it to give credits to investors, tax credits to investors, there is a large welfare gain. But then again, different models actually disagree about whether these are real gains or whether they're smaller. So yes, this works in theory. Yes, we've seen it in models. But what do we need for this to make it work in reality? What we need is politicians who resist the temptation to use the carbon tax revenue. Well, first, we need politicians who are smart enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the carbon tax. I'll talk about that this afternoon. Second, we need politicians who resist the temptation to use the carbon tax revenue to reward their political allies, to reward the people who voted for them, to give themselves bigger offices. And given those two conditions, we then need politicians who actually know and understand their economy and what the fiscal system does to their economy to pick out what is the appropriate tax reform for my country at this time. Those are a lot of ifs. So therefore, I think this is a nice theoretical argument. I don't think that there's any parliament in the world who would actually be able to deliver on this. So I don't think it's real. I think it's just nice work for the ivory tower. I see you guys this afternoon.